Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of The Suited Shootist. This one I'm going to try and keep a little more brief, but it's something that I want to touch on, and I've talked about it before. You see a lot of comments as it pertains to concealment, especially when you are talking about folks that either have a new carry pistol or a new set of wardrobe requirements that they are trying to integrate a new carry pistol into. And usually, in the comments section of posts like this, you will see a pretty broad spread of what people think is acceptable concealment. And I think it's really important to dig into that because concealment is not this binary pass fail. It is very much a sliding scale of how much concealment is required in a given circumstance. I really like the way Mike Green at Green Ops breaks this down in his covert carry class. And essentially, the way he sort of quantifies everything is there's basically three levels. You've got covered carry, which is basically just that. It is, something where it is simply covered by a garment almost as a formality or almost just to be polite. A good example of this would be, for example, a plainclothes law enforcement officer or a relatively overt security force, like the Secret Service is a good example. They're not trying to hide the fact that they're armed. You can pretty well pick these folks out of a crowd. They just don't want their firearms to be on display. That doesn't really apply to us. Unfortunately, I do see a lot of concealed carriers and a lot of regular Earth people who say they're concealed carrying when in reality they're just covered carrying. The next one is concealed carry, and John Houtman over at Filster has a really good definition of what he deems as the threshold of concealed, which is that someone would have to violate social norms in a very obvious fashion in order for them to visually identify the fact that you're armed, whether that means physically touching you in some kind of way that is, not within the bounds of social norms outside of people that you are very familiar with, or extended, visual contact beyond kind of, what we would consider average. So if somebody is staring at you, really giving you a hard once-over, then the third level that Mike talks about is covert carry, as he calls it. Daryl Bulkey and the guys over at Hardwire call it undetectable. And that one is really short of either a metal detector or a physical pat-down style search. They're not going to find the firearm. So let's talk about how this actually relates to the concealed carrier, to the civilian defender, to us regular Earth people. And like I said, concealment is varying degrees. And it's going to really depend on the deciding factor that Mike Green talks about, which is degree of consequence. Because the less consequences there are, the less effective your concealment arguably has to be. Again, this is why, people who are carrying guns professionally, credentialed folks, where being armed is part of the job description, they don't necessarily have to put as much thought or care into it because, number one, access arguably may be a little bit more critical than concealment, depending on the role. And, they're not really worried about getting made. They've got a permission slip in the form of their credentials. So you can argue that the concealed carrier has their permission slip as well as it pertains to a carry permit or the states that have adopted constitutional carry. However, the reality is that unless you are living amongst a population that is exclusively supportive of firearms and firearms carry, it can still raise some eyebrows. I mean, a good example, a few years back, I was working with a commercial construction organization. I mean, very stereotypical good old boys club, down here in Texas, and very conservative leaning political philosophies in the office. Not a single one of them actually carried a firearm. And I can tell you that if I had ever walked into the office at that spot, um, overtly concealing, for as much of an oxymoron as that is, it would have raised some eyebrows. Because they don't, these folks don't have anything against guns, but the attitude would be, well, why do you feel like it's necessary to carry one here? Let's not get into the discussion of, only carrying your gun in bad places and all that crap. But the point is that even amongst people for whom firearms are not a taboo or offensive subject, there can be circumstances where regularly concealed carrying a pistol is still seen as weird. And so that's where this threshold, this sliding scale comes into play. What I'm wearing today is a good example of what 9 times out of 10 I would not consider effective concealed carry. Aside from the fact, nobody really knows what the ShivWorks logo is unless you're part of that particular, sphere. Most folks ask me if this is some kind of Cobra Kai thing. But when you look at this, this is not concealed. This is, in my opinion, open carry with extra steps. Now, I'm doing this as an exaggeration because this is not actually one of my carry guns. This is a Glock 17 replica with a TLR, because this is basically the biggest, frame pistol that I have. There are people that are perfectly content to just go through life with this level of concealment. Depending on the environment, okay. This level of sort of overt concealed carry, I'm really only going to do this if I'm literally on my way to go do a firearms related activity. So if I'm going to the range, if I'm going to a competition, something like that, and I'm not making many, if any, stops along the way, sure, cool, no problem. So really, what I try and go for, more often than not, is as close to undetectable as possible. And here's why. There's really no good reason not to. It makes life easier, and it helps to reduce what John and Sarah Haltman coined, at least where I heard it originally, the expression of social friction. Because, for as many folks that are sympathetic and supportive to what we do as there is still at large a much higher concentration of people that view an armed lifestyle as unusual to some degree. And simply by going from a 17 to a 19, this is already a whole lot better. I mean, yeah, I've got a little bit of a shelf going here because of the belt, but that's not really nearly as overt. Still getting a little bit of printing here, but again, I typically don't carry with a light. This floodlight holster is not set up to maximize concealment for me. I have it just kind of as a general purpose demonstration tool. But there are circumstances where even this would still not be sufficiently discreet for my needs, especially if I'm going to be in a professional or social circumstance where I may be the only gun guy, I may be the only training junkie. So there's those circumstances where there's a whole lot of benefit to flying under the radar, because people do notice things that will deviate from their expectations. When you look at evolution at large, whether it is a predatory animal or whether it is a prey animal, and depending on what era in history you look at, we've been on both sides of that equation. One of the survival mechanisms is understanding what your sort of status quo is, so that you can pick up on deviations of that, because depending on the circumstance, it's either food or it's trying to fucking kill you. And so the idea that people don't notice it's a lazy dismissal that glosses over a lot of very critical elements. And I've already done a video on that, but I want to just bring it back up because of that idea that concealment has to be a sliding scale. depending on who you're around and the consequences that you can suffer if you are discovered to be armed, then those are the circumstances where going to covert, undetectable, physical pat down requirement type concealment really is going to make a lot more sense. Are you sacrificing a certain degree of access? Yes, absolutely. But if the other option is either suffering unacceptable consequences or not having a firearm at all, there's a huge benefit to having a 2.5 second draw versus a 25-minute draw, because you've got to get in your car and go get your pistol. And that's really where I think a lot of people miss this discussion, is when they are comparing the situational reality with optimal performance and optimal outcome. You see this discussion a lot when it comes to the firearm size as well, where people will say, well, why are you carrying a 365 as opposed to a 19, or, yada, yada, yada. Sometimes it's not picking a 365 instead of a 19. Sometimes it's a 365 instead of nothing. Or sometimes it's, an LCP 22 instead of nothing, or just pepper spray. Or, I've heard some of the mouse guns referred to as a loud knife, and I think that's actually a really good way to sort of frame it. But the idea being that you've got to really objectively look at your use case and figure out what degree of concealment is actually required. And then, personally, my attitude is, whatever degree of concealment is actually required, I go a little further. Because everybody gets caught slipping eventually. And it's really amusing, because the irony of it is that a lot of these people that will accept the absolute bare minimum performance standards on concealment are the ones that really aggressively hammer not accepting mediocrity and always pushing the bounds of performance when it comes to the actual technical shooting piece of it. So there's this inconsistency in the thought process that I personally find a little amusing. So I'm curious to hear how you approach this, because everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. So put that down in the comments. Other than that, hope everybody has a fantastic week. Stay dangerous. Stay sharp.